The generator out back sputtered, coughed like a dying man, and then surrendered to the silence of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The lights in the cabin flickered and died, plunging my makeshift office into a darkness so thick it felt like mud in my throat. I sat there for a moment, listening. In Appalachia, silence isn't empty, it's waiting. I was 3 days into an audit for the Blackwood Coal Company, staying in their guest cabin at the bottom of a ravine specifically designed to kill cell service. My job was simple: find the missing assets before the IRS seized the land. But the deeper I dug into the boxes of moldy receipts, the more I felt like the land was digging into me. Scritch, scritch, slide. The sound came from the front porch. It wasn't a raccoon. It was the distinct, dry sound of paper sliding over rough timber. I grabbed the heavy iron flashlight from the table, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed instantly by the heavy quilt of the humid night air. No answer. Just the drip, drip, drip of condensation falling from the tin roof. I walked to the front door. The wood was swollen with dampness, and I had to shoulder it open. The beam of my light cut through the fog that had settled in the hollow like spilled milk. There was no one there, but sitting on the rotting welcome mat was a thick manila envelope. It wasn't one of the Blackwood files. It was fresh, crisp. I picked it up. It was cold, unnaturally so, like it had been pulled out of a deep freezer. On the front, written in charcoal or maybe crushed coal dust, was a single word in my own handwriting: recalculated. A shiver chased itself down my spine. I hadn't been outside in 4 hours. I locked the door and retreated to the kitchen, lighting the kerosene lamp I kept for emergencies. The amber glow threw long, dancing shadows against the log walls. I opened the clasp. The metal tab snapped with a sound like a breaking finger. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It wasn't standard printer paper. It was thick, fibrous, like pressed birch bark. It was an inventory list. 02:14 a.m. Auditor locates package. 02:15 a.m. Discrepancy denied. 02:17 a.m. The cats provide warning. 02:20 a.m. Window 3 minutes. I looked at my watch. 02:15 a.m. This isn't funny, I whispered to the empty room. My voice shook. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled under the cast iron stove. I swung the light down. My 2 barn cats, Whiskey and Rue, were huddled there, but they weren't looking at me. They were staring up at the ceiling, their eyes wide, pupils blown out so black they looked like holes in their heads. Their fur was standing straight up, stiff as wire. Rue let out a sound I'd never heard a cat make, a low, wet gurgle like she was choking on blood. 02:17 a.m. The cats provide warning. The air in the cabin shifted. The smell of old pine and kerosene vanished, replaced by the stinging scent of ozone and copper, the smell of a storm or a nosebleed. I looked back at the paper. The ink was moving. The charcoal letters were crawling across the page like black ants. The numbers for 02:17 a.m. dissolved, swirling into a tight spiral before sinking into the paper. Then came the sound. It started in the walls. Click, 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 click. It sounded like 1,000 typewriters manic to finish a page, or 1,000 beetles chewing through the logs. It was coming from everywhere: the floorboards, the ceiling, the pantry. I backed away, bumping into the kitchen island. A stack of the Blackwood files toppled over. As the papers hit the floor, they didn't scatter. They organized. I watched in horror as the receipts and ledgers shuffled themselves, sliding over each other with a hiss, forming neat, impossible stacks that rose toward the ceiling like stalagmites. They defied gravity. And then I saw the duplicates. On the table, the envelope I had just opened was there, but next to it was another one, and another, and another. They were multiplying, budding off of each other like cancerous cells. In seconds, the table was covered. I grabbed one at random. June's funeral expenses, projected. June's missing persons report, draft 2. June's body recovery, location, the old tobacco barn. My breath hitched. The old tobacco barn was 100 yards up the ridge, a ruin I'd been warned to stay away from because of structural instability. 2:20 a.m. Window. 3 minutes. The sound of the clicking stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. My ears popped. I looked at the kitchen window above the sink. The glass was dark, reflecting only the kerosene lamp and my own pale, terrified face. Then, my reflection blinked. I didn't. My reflection smiled, a wide, impossibly stretched grin that showed too many teeth. Then a hand slapped against the glass from the outside. It wasn't a hand. It was a flat, two-dimensional photocopy of a hand. Then a face pressed against the glass, a Xeroxed face, my face, distorted, high contrast black and white, eyes hollowed out into white voids. Slap, slap, slap. More sheets of paper hit the window, dozens of them, copies of my face, screaming, laughing, crying. They plastered themselves against the wet glass, blocking out the night, layering over each other until the window was just a wall of dead, staring eyes. The glass began to groan. A spiderweb crack appeared in the center, spiraling outward in a perfect Fibonacci sequence. I couldn't breathe. The cabin was filling up. The stacks of paper on the floor were waist-high now, shifting like dunes. I had to get out. The front door was blocked by a wall of envelopes. The back door. I grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove, a useless weapon against this, but it felt heavy, real. I scrambled over the shifting mounds of paper, my boots sinking into the ledgers like quicksand. I kicked the back door open and tumbled out into the mud. The night air should have been a relief. It wasn't. The fog had solidified. It wasn't mist anymore. It was translucent vellum. The trees looked flat, like bad stage scenery painted on cardboard. The world was losing its depth. I scrambled up the muddy bank, gasping for air. The clicking sound was behind me now, pouring out of the cabin. I looked up the ridge. The outline of the old tobacco barn loomed against the gray sky. It was the only thing that looked real. The wood looked rotting, heavy, three-dimensional. I ran. My boots slipped on wet leaves and coal shale. I didn't look back at the cabin. I could hear the windows blowing out, the sound of 1,000,000 sheets of paper erupting into the night. I reached the barn, my lungs burning. The giant double doors were hanging off their hinges, revealing a maw of darkness. I slipped inside, the smell of curing tobacco and ancient dust hitting me. I fell to my knees in the dirt, clutching the skillet, waiting for my eyes to adjust. I clicked the flashlight on. The barn wasn't empty. Hanging from the rafters, where the tobacco leaves should have been curing, were people. But they weren't bodies. They were husks. They were made of papier-mâché, layers of old newspapers, receipts, and tax forms glued together to form hollow human shapes.
They spun slowly in the draft, hundreds of them, their paper limbs rustling dryly. And in the center of the barn, sitting on a crate, was a figure. It worked at a desk made of old railroad ties. It looked up. It was wrapped in forestry tape, that bright orange plastic ribbon surveyors use to mark trees for cutting. The tape was wound tight around a humanoid form, dirty and frayed, caked with mud. "You're late, June," it said. The voice wasn't human. It sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. It held up a pen. "The audit is almost closed. We just need to verify the final asset."
The thing wrapped in orange forestry tape stood up. As it moved, the plastic ribbons crinkled and stretched, revealing glimpses of something dark and wet underneath, like rot moving inside a plastic bag. I scrambled backward, crab-walking through the dirt until my back hit the rough timber wall of the barn. "What are you?" I choked out, swinging the flashlight beam like a sword. "I am the assessor," the thing rasped. It didn't have a mouth, just a horizontal slit in the tape that tore open when it spoke. "And you are the encroaching error." It stepped over the railroad-tied desk. Its legs were too long, bending with a sickening snap at the knees with each step, like breaking dry branches. "The Blackwood account is overdrawn," it said, the voice buzzing like a hornet's nest. "The mountain requires a balance, a trade, flesh for coal, bone for timber." It reached into the pile of papers on the desk and pulled out a long, serrated blade, but it wasn't metal. It was a giant letter opener, rusted and pitted, the handle wrapped in raw hide. "You've been recalculating the numbers," I stammered, my mind racing to find a logic, any logic in this nightmare. "The envelopes, the dates." "Projections," the assessor corrected. It tilted its head, the orange tape glistening in my flashlight beam. "We run the scenarios. We simulate the yield. You, June, had a high probability of spoilage. No family, no children, a solitary unit, efficient to liquidate." It took another step. Snap, crunch. Above us, the paper husks hanging from the rafters began to rustle. They were waking up, their hollow newsprint heads turned toward me. I looked at the barn door. It was blocked by a wall of fog so dense it looked like a white cliff face. "You can't leave," the assessor buzzed. "The boundary line has been redrawn. The cabin is outside the zone. This barn is the filing cabinet." It lunged. I threw the iron skillet. It was a desperate, stupid move, but it hit the assessor square in the chest. There was no thud of impact against flesh. Instead, the skillet sank into the creature's chest with a wet squelch, as if I had thrown it into a pile of mud and tape. The creature stopped, looking down at the pan embedded in its torso. It didn't seem in pain. It seemed annoyed. "An unapproved deduction," it hissed. I turned and ran toward the hayloft ladder. It was my only chance. I scrambled up the rotting wooden rungs, splinters digging into my palms. Below me, the assessor roared, a sound of tearing metal and wind. I felt a hand grab my ankle. It wasn't a hand. It was a loop of sticky orange tape. It whipped around my boot, tightening instantly, cutting off circulation. I kicked out, my other heel smashing into the creature's face. The tape tore. Beneath the orange plastic, I saw an eye. It wasn't a human eye. It was a knot in the wood, a swirl of dark, ancient timber that blinked. I screamed and kicked again, harder. The tape snapped. I hauled myself onto the loft floor, gasping, rolling into the darkness. "The inventory must be completed,"
The voice shrieked from below. I crawled deeper into the loft. It was filled with old farming equipment, scythes, rusted plows, coils of wire, and boxes, bankers' boxes, thousands of them. I shone my light on the nearest stack. They were covered in dust, but the labels were legible. Elias Blackwood, 1924, liquidated. Sarah Miller, 1955, liquidated. Hikers, Group 4, 1998, files merged. I froze. This wasn't just about me. This was the mountain's history. Every missing person, every hunting accident, every vanished without a trace story in the county. They weren't lost. They were filed. The floorboards creaked. I spun around. Emerging from the shadows of the loft wasn't the assessor. It was my cats, Whiskey and Rue. But they were wrong. They had been fused together. Their bodies were wrapped in twine and old receipts, creating a single multi-limbed mass of fur and paper. They moved with a jerky, spider-like coordination. Their mouths were gone, replaced by staples. Behind them, the darkness of the loft began to glow with a dull phosphorescent green, the color of foxfire, the glowing fungus on rotting wood. "Don't look at them," I whispered to myself. "Find the window."
The barn loft had a hay door, the big opening they used to pitch hay into the wagons. I saw the outline of it against the glowing moss on the wall. I grabbed a rusted scythe from the floor. The handle was brittle, but the blade was still wicked. The assessor pulled itself up onto the loft floor. It had shed the forestry tape. Now it was just a silhouette of dark, shifting earth and roots holding the rusted letter opener. "End of quarter June," it rumbled. The voice was deeper now, vibrating in my chest bones. "Time to close the books." I backed up toward the hay door. "I'm not an asset," I yelled, the defiance feeling pitiful against the weight of the monster. "I'm a person." "A distinction without a difference," it said. It raised the blade. I turned and threw the latch on the hay door. It was rusted stuck. The assessor lunged. I swung the scythe. It caught the creature in the midsection, slicing through the roots and mud. But instead of blood, a torrent of black ink poured out. Thick, viscous printer ink mixed with coal sludge. It sprayed over me, blinding, suffocating. I kicked the door with everything I had. The wood splintered. The door swung open. I didn't wait. I jumped. I expected to hit the muddy ground of the cow pasture, a 15-foot drop. I braced for broken legs. I didn't hit the ground. I hit paper. I landed with a soft thump on a surface that yielded like a mattress. I scrambled to my feet, wiping the black sludge from my eyes. I wasn't outside. I was in a giant, infinite warehouse. The sky was a grid of fluorescent lights miles above, buzzing like cicadas. The ground was made of stacked envelopes, endless hills and valleys of beige paper stretching out to the horizon. I looked back up. The barn door I had jumped from was just a small, square hole in the ceiling of this impossible room. And standing around me, as far as the eye could see, were the others, the husks, the people made of paper. They were standing in neat rows, millions of them. Some were old and yellowed, dating back centuries. Some were fresh and white. They were all silent, their heads bowed. I looked down at my hands. The ink that had sprayed on me, it wasn't washing off. It was soaking in. My skin was turning white. My veins were turning into blue lines. My knuckles were sharpening,
becoming corners. "No," I whispered. My voice sounded flat, papery. A giant hand, the size of a house, descended from the darkness above the lights. It held a stamp the size of a truck. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't bend. They were stiff, cardstock. I looked at my arm. It was flat. I was two-dimensional. I looked up at the stamp hurtling toward me. I could read the letters on the rubber face, reversed, coming down to seal my fate. Archived. I realized then why the silence in the woods felt so heavy. It wasn't peace. It was the quiet of a library.